For over 3 centuries, Assyria ruled the ancient Near East through calculated cruelty. Deportations of entire peoples, public executions of conquered kings, and stone reliefs of tortured enemies were not hidden away as grim secrets. They decorated royal palaces as proof of power. That formula worked for generations, but by the middle of the 7th century BC, the empire that had once sacked Babylon and burned Egyptian cities was rotting from within. King Ashurbanipal, its last truly powerful ruler, died around 627 BC, leaving behind a throne no successor could hold steady. Within a decade, kings rose and fell through palace coups and civil wars, and provinces that had endured Assyrian domination for generations sensed the weakness and began to move. Babylon rebelled first. In 626 BC, the Chaldean leader Nabopolassar seized the city and declared himself king of a new Babylonian kingdom. Assyria's army tried to retake it and failed, an outcome that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Meanwhile, in the east, a vassal kingdom was quietly transforming into something far more dangerous. The Medes, under a ruler named Cyaxares, abandoned their old tribal levies for a professional army organized into disciplined units of spearmen, archers, and cavalry. Essentially a copy of Assyrian military doctrine, now turned against its creators. Around 615 BC, Cyaxares marched west, not to raid but to dismantle Assyrian rule piece by piece. His forces crossed the Greater Zab and pushed into Assyria's heartland, while border towns surrendered before his cavalry even arrived. In Nineveh, King Sennacherib received the reports, but no unified counterattack followed. Coordination between garrisons collapsed. Years of endless warfare had drained Assyria's manpower. Deported populations no longer supplied loyal recruits but deserters, and mercenaries demanded pay the treasury could no longer provide as provinces stopped sending taxes. While Nineveh's commanders debated how many regiments they could spare without leaving the capital exposed, Cyaxares had already chosen his true target, not Nineveh, but Assur, the ancient capital, spiritual heart of the empire, the city that shared its name with the chief god. Taking Assur would announce to the entire region that Assyria's gods had failed. By the summer of 614 BC, the dust of the Median army was visible on the horizon, and everyone watching from Assur's walls understood the same brutal arithmetic. No reinforcements were coming. Messages to Nineveh returned with promises, but promises are not soldiers. Assyria's field army, once able to muster 100,000 men, was now scattered thin across garrisons from Egypt to the Zagros foothills, each clinging to its post without orders to march. Sennacherib's advisors, thinking chiefly of their own survival, refused to weaken the capital by sending help, the classic sickness of a dying regime, where elites stop defending the state and start saving themselves. While the defenders waited in vain, a second army crept up the Tigris from the south. Nabopolassar advanced at a deliberate, unhurried pace. Not the speed of an ally rushing to relieve a siege, but the pace of a man arriving to divide the spoils once the fighting was done. He intended to let Median blood take the city, while Babylon secured its share through diplomacy alone. Assur itself was formidable on paper, perched on a bluff above the Tigris, guarded by the river on one side and by thick brick walls, towers, and a ditch on the others. Fortifications built up over a millennium and a half. But walls without enough soldiers are just stone, and the garrison was critically undermanned for a 4-kilometer perimeter. Cyaxares showed no interest in the old Assyrian practice of selective terror followed by deportation. His forces destroyed all who resisted, sparing only those who surrendered outright, a deliberate campaign of psychological warfare where each ruined city became a warning to the next. Median engineers approached the walls under covering fire to measure foundations and test the masonry, absorbing losses without slowing down. Assur's walls combined an outer shell of fired brick with a core of packed earth and mud brick, making them resistant to a frontal battering, so the Medes focused on undermining the foundations instead. Massive battering rams, built from timber cut in Assyrian forests and swung from iron-reinforced housings covered in fresh hides to resist fire, began pounding the walls in a relentless rhythm, while earthen ramps rose to bring siege towers level with the ramparts. A desperate chariot sortie to destroy the siege works ended in disaster. Median cavalry, waiting at a distance, closed on the flanks and shattered the attack within minutes, and the gates never opened again for an assault. As battering rams widened cracks in the northeastern wall, Median sappers began digging tunnels angled beneath the towers. Patient, silent work meant to end not in a breach, but in collapse. Assyrian engineers, veterans of siege warfare themselves, tried to detect the tunnels acoustically, using bronze basins with taut membranes to catch the vibration of digging underground, then cutting counter-tunnels toward the sound. When the two met, men fought hand-to-hand in absolute darkness, armed only with short daggers, in tunnels too cramped to swing a sword. Above ground, the noose tightened. Median cavalry sealed every river crossing north and south of the city, cutting off all movement by land or water. No messenger, no boat, nothing got through. Every arrow fired by the garrison was now irreplaceable, every wounded soldier lost for good. Meanwhile, priests in the temple of the god Ashur read the omens through Assyria's ancient system of divination. The condition of a sacrificed animal's liver, the flight patterns of birds, the shape of oil on water, and every reading came back the same: catastrophe. They dared not announce this publicly, since their official role was to sustain morale, so purification rituals normally performed once a month began happening every few days, and the people of Assur read the meaning behind that shift as clearly as the priests themselves. Grain rations shrank. Statues of minor gods were quietly moved into the central sanctuary, officially to concentrate sacred power, in truth, to protect them from looting if the walls fell. Refugees from the countryside brought first-hand accounts of what happened to towns that resisted the Medes. No ransom, no mercy, nothing left standing. That knowledge changed how soldiers fought. A man who expects captivity fights as a person hoping to survive. A man who expects certain death fights without that hope at all, and sometimes breaks sooner because there is no fallback left to imagine. On the last night, Median campfires burned deliberately loud, a calculated denial of rest for a garrison Cyaxares wanted exhausted before the final assault. At dawn, trumpets sounded from every direction at once. Rams struck in unison, siege towers rolled forward on log paths, and deep underground a man set fire to pitch-soaked kindling beneath the northern tower. The wooden supports burned through, and the tower, which had stood for centuries, first tilted, then groaned, then collapsed in stages into its own crater, burying nearby archers under tons of falling brick. Median infantry poured through the breach even as rams punched through the wall elsewhere, and within 20 minutes a second opening was wide enough for men to pass two abreast. What followed was street-by-street fighting through narrow alleys. The Assyrians knew intimately, and the Medes did not, a final, marginal advantage that only delayed the inevitable by minutes at each barricade. When the main gate was finally forced open from inside, heavy cavalry rode down the ceremonial processional avenue that had once carried religious parades. Cyaxares had ordered no exceptions. Those who resisted were killed, and those who surrendered were killed as well. This was not battlefield rage but deliberate policy. Assur was meant to stop existing as a place where people lived, not merely as an administrative center. At the temple of Ashur, priests barred the doors and stood before the god's statues as the last defense they had. The wooden doors did not hold. Excavations by a German expedition in the early 20th century confirmed what the sparse written sources imply. The temple's cult statues were smashed deliberately, since in the religious logic of the ancient Near East, a shattered statue meant a defeated god. Archives of clay tablets recording property, debts, and history were targeted for destruction too. Erasing a people's archive erases its ability to reconstitute itself as a state, though ironically the intense heat of burning actually hardened many tablets, preserving them for archaeologists millennia later. By evening, columns of smoke marked quarter after quarter put to the torch, visible for miles along the Tigris, smoke that Nabopolassar's slow-marching army almost certainly saw from a distance. He arrived days after the city had fallen, meeting Cyaxares amid the ruins to formalize an alliance. Spheres of influence divided between Medes and Babylonians, sealed by the future marriage of Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadnezzar to Cyaxares' daughter Amytis. Nabopolassar got legitimacy over his share of the conquest without spending his own soldiers' blood. Cyaxares secured recognition from the region's other great power and a safe southern flank for his continuing campaign. Assur paid for that bargain with its existence. Its surviving population marched off into servitude. Its granaries and remaining wooden structures burned a second time before the armies withdrew, ensuring nothing was left to rebuild from. Nineveh fell 2 years later, in 612 BC, to the same coalition and the same methods. An empire that had terrorized the Near East for 3 centuries vanished within a few short years, faster than almost anyone alive at the time could have predicted. The answer lies less in Cyaxares' brilliance or Nabopolassar's cunning than in the nature of the Assyrian system itself. A state built purely on fear holds together only as long as the center inspiring that fear stays strong. The moment it falters, there is no deeper loyalty to fall back on. Only provinces waiting for their chance to break free, a chance that, in 614 BC, finally came.